Suicide Note, by Mitchell Heisman. This work is a computer-generated reading of Suicide Note, by Mitchell Heisman. This reading was produced using Natural Reader 14, a product of Natural Soft Limited. This work is free and licensed by Mitchell Heisman for copying and distribution under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivative Works 3.0 United States license. Part 1. God is Technology. How the singularity of monotheism transcended biology and primed the technological genesis of God. The agony of victory. The Unchosen. When religious belief declined in modern times, the mosaic symbiosis of genes and memes began to fall apart with it. Which was the more important inheritance of Judaism, the Jews, or the ism? Can Jewish values be separated from the Jewish people? Questions outbred their answers. Even in times of belief there was, in practice, no consistent answer, only conflicting interpretations and its sectarian consequences, of which Christianity is an extreme example. The very argumentativeness of Jews that spawned political disunity also stimulated a high rate of memic ideological mutation, and hence, memic evolution. Only belief in God could make a single goal appear possible for all Jews. Out of the aftermath of traditional belief sprang a kind of adaptive radiation into various, relatively partial isms such as capitalism, communism, democracy, and Zionism. Collapse of Jewish unity in God unleashed, in the view of some, modern chaos. Yet the distinctive, net profile of this adaptive radiation, as compared with any Gentile nation, reveals something of its ancient fountainhead. The original gene/mem symbiosis of Judaism is still discernible after its modern undoing into two extreme and opposite implications, Zionism and Marxism. Zionism radicalized the implications of Jewish gene propagation while Marxism radicalized the implications of Jewish mem propagation. Within Judaism, these extremes were largely moderated by a symbiotic center of gravity that, in secular terms, is most compatible with liberal capitalistic democracy. The State of Israel reflects the entire range of this paradoxical dynamic. Normative Jewish nationalism culminated in a liberal democratic state. One minority of Zionist Jews embraced the right, i.e. the revisionism of Vladimir Jabotinsky. Another minority among the original settlers were left-leaning Jewish national communists, the kibbutzniks. A general difference between most Gentile nations and the Jews is that the entire normative political spectrum, or bell curve, is shifted towards the left. The continuity between ancient and modern Jewish moral tendencies can be best appreciated through contrast with the nations Jews came into greatest conflict with. The Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, medieval Europeans and, most radically, the Nazis, evolved polities rooted in some form of kin selection. A superlative development of kin-selective order is what I called the Uberorganism. Within the political whole of an Uberorganism, there may be differentiations of rank or some form of caste. From this point of view, the source of Jewish dissidence could be described as an inverse differentiation. While straightforward kin selection tends to develop towards the political, Jewish conscience tends to differentiate on the basis of individuals against the political. Independent of politics, this tendency emerges organically as an extreme implication of the Jewish kinship paradox. What Jews have in common with themselves is a tendency to divide among themselves. This means that the Jewish tendency towards internal differentiation or division is generally more intense than that of Gentiles. On a mental level, it is related to a highly analytical cast of mind. On a socio-biological level, it means extreme differentiation to the point of discontinuity on the level of individual members. Judaism interprets this phenomenon as a positive, the infinite value of every separate life. This is how Judaism came to value the extreme implications of the Jewish kinship paradox as an ultimate positive. The solution of reconciling Jewish individualism with Jewish socialism emerged though valuing alone, politically alienated dissenter, a voice in the wilderness, as a representative, or conscience, of larger social concerns. The conflict between dissenting Jewish individualism and conscientious Jewish socialism leads towards resolution through a logic of self-consistency. That is, if the dissenter castigates the privileged on the grounds of social inconsistency or a double standard, then resolution implies equality or consistency of conditions between the privileged and the underprivileged. For example, political activist of Jewish descent, Noam Chomsky, has often accused the United States of terrorism. He demanded that it apply to its own actions the moral standards it demands of others. This, in a nutshell, is what I mean by the principle of self-consistency. It means, most simply, to not be a hypocrite. From an external view, to be morally self-consistent means to hold oneself accountable by the moral standards one holds for others. From an internal view, moral self-consistency means to love your neighbor as yourself. In secular terms, this could mean, at bare minimum, to grant the rights to others that one grants to oneself. The logic behind the idea of human equality is self-consistency, a single, consistent standard equally applicable to all humans. This MIT professor is well known for his anti-American and anti-Israel views. Chomsky, hell-bent on exposing the moral blind spots of these countries, portrays them as terrorist states routinely engaged in systematic hypocrisy to the detriment of other people. In The Fateful Triangle, 1983, for example, he claimed that Israel and the United States have opposed peace while the Palestinians have gradually come to terms with the existence of Israel. Chomsky has strongly supported Israel Shahak, a Holocaust survivor who has spoken out and criticized aspects of Orthodox Judaism that could be considered racist. Both have displayed pro-Palestinian views that vilify Israel. They concur that Jews, in principle, can indeed become Nazis. Like the prophets before them, Chomsky and Shahak rebuke their people against the temptation to be no better than their historic persecutors. Chomsky defended Holocaust denier Robert Frisson on the grounds of freedom of speech. This too, is self-consistency. Chomsky is upholding the right of dissenters like himself to be heard, whether he agrees with them or not. There are more than a few Jews and non-Jews who would like to see Chomsky silenced. By defending Frisson without catering to special Jewish sorrows, Chomsky is defending the freedom of all. Some in the Jewish community consider his defense of Holocaust deniers, along with his pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel positions, to be a form of self-hatred. But, as another Jewish universalist named Rosa Luxemburg put it, freedom is always the freedom of those who disagree. Luxemburg's humanitarian vision of Marxism guided her organization of socialist movements in Poland and Germany. In a letter dated February 16, 1917, she wrote, "Why do you come to me with your special Jewish sorrows? I feel just as sorry for the wretched Indian victims in Putumayo. I cannot find a special corner in my heart for the ghetto. I feel at home in the entire world wherever there are clouds and birds and human tears." Luxemburg was co-founder of the German Communist Party. She was assassinated by German nationalists in 1919. Here we have Marx, Chomsky, Luxemburg, and other unchosen Jews, mortal messiahs leading humankind to its grand, universal, promised land. This is typical Jewish un-Jewishness. This is the Jewish national/international paradox, a logical fulfillment of the Jewish kinship paradox. Chomsky and Marx, above all, illustrate the full force of the paradox potential of the Jewish kinship paradox. Ironically, or, in conformity with the Jewish kinship paradox, internationalism emerges as an advanced development of this form of Jewish national differentiation. The Jewish kinship paradox means that by obeying biological inclination, a Jew could dissent against the straightforward biological logic of kin selection, Jewish nepotism. An implication of this paradox is that Jews are to some extent distinct from Gentiles in that they share a quality that can be, in effect, indifferent to kinship or even anti-kin selective. Within this scenario, a Jew could divide against Jews because, and not despite, that common Jewishness. Chomsky and Marx exemplify this paradox in the logic of Jewish moral self-consistency. To fully realize Jewish ethics, a Jew must transcend its Jewish roots. A certain breed of un-Jewish or anti-Jewish universalism is, in a certain way, the most supremely Jewish. Jewish universalism is a kind of Jewish self-realization in the same sense that the Jewish invention of a single God implicated all humanity. Since Judaism is a technology, a behavioral self-corrective, Judaism can be described as a form of Jewish self-criticism. Moses was a critic of Jewish criticism, instituting his critic commandments from the supranational point of view of God. Marx's views emerged from a Jewish self-criticism of Jewish economic power. Chomsky's views emerged from a Jewish self-criticism of Jewish media power. It is not an accident that Chomsky replaced Marx as the most revered figure of the radical left. If Jews, in Marx's mind, were the arch-capitalists, then the anti-arch-capitalists were represented by the communist faction. What Marx called class was expressed in previous Jewish history as faction. When this socio-biological basis for Marxism converged with the most important Gentile corroboration, misinterpretation, of a class system in the apparent factionalism of the Norman/Saxon conflict, Marx's view of history as a clash of classes was born. Under conditions where Jews were oppressed as a group, proto-leftist anti-political behaviors could advance Jewish genetic interests, since there was a convergence of kinship and conscience. Taken out of context, however, in situations where class has been severed from race, the radical forms of these evolved behaviors could be considered genetically maladaptive. There are countless examples of Jewish activists who have taken up the cause of Jewish values in opposition to special Jewish sorrows. One could cite George Soros, a routine supporter of Palestinians over Jewish or Israeli causes. Another contender is former civil rights defender William Kunstler, at one time probably the most hated lawyer in America. Among his clients were Martin Luther King, Jr., Malcolm X, Lenny Bruce, the Chicago Seven, Islamic terrorists, and murderers of Jews. Norman Finkelstein, a son of survivors of Nazi concentration camps, accused some Jews of exploiting the Holocaust and opposed the existence of the State of Israel. Like Finkelstein, Chomsky championed the universality of values that have deep historical roots in Judaism. The universality of these values can be taken seriously only if there are those like Chomsky to defend the underdog, even when Jews are the power interest exactly because Jews have risen to power. Otherwise, Chomsky's values are not universal, but rather, an expression of the will to power of the powerless. This linguist, son of a Hebrew scholar, found a theoretical justification for human universalism in his theory of a universal human grammar. In this case, the notion of a biologically based human nature was partly compelled in refutation of the totalitarian implications of B. F. Skinner's extreme environmentalism. Yet, despite the attempt of a Polish Jew named Ludwig Lazarus Zamenhof, 1859–1917, to create a universal language called Esperanto, the insight of Spanish-American philosopher George Santayana still holds: it is no more possible to be a human being in general than it is to speak a language in general. Chomsky's typical Jewish unjewishness is comparable only with Marx as a peak modern expression of the logic of Jewish moral self-consistency. To stand consistently against discrimination on the basis of biological differences among humans is to stand against sexism, homophobia, and racism. To stand self-consistently against racial prejudice is to not be prejudiced towards one's own race. It leads one to not choosing one's own people. Yet the idea of a chosen people, while seen as ethnocentric, is really an ancient resolution to this same national/international paradox. Jews were chosen by God, they did not select themselves, but were selected by an inscrutable supranational standard above all biological humans. Jewish internationalism is characterized by universalist self-consistency without Jewish self-reference. If taken seriously, this Jewish lack of self-reference decouples Marxism from anything particular related to Marx. I call this Jewish unchosenness. To realize the extreme implications of Jewish morality means to unrealize the implications of being born Jewish. It leads to the relatively consistent humanistic proposition that the Jewish origins of Christianity or Marxism do not matter, just as the Jewish origins of individuals who happen to be Jews should not matter. Why should Chomsky choose Jewish causes over non-Jewish causes simply because he himself is a Jew? Just as normative kin selection leads towards favoritism for one's own, the Jewish kinship paradox culminates in a specific disfavoritism of one's own. In consequence, the Jewish self-hatred that Marx and Chomsky have been charged with is something of a misnomer. Disfavoritism towards one's own people is a corollary, and not an aberration, of extreme, self-consistent internationalism. The true proof of moral self-consistency is demonstrated by dissenting against privilege exactly when one is implicated as a member or beneficiary of any kind of specialness or chosenness. In practice, this leads a Jew to anti-Zionism or a generally anti-Jewish orientation. But the joke, of course, is on these anti-Jewish Jews, for this extreme, leftist, intellectual, anti-Jewish Jewishness exemplified by Chomsky and Marx is the most Jewish of all.